I'm Monica Toft. I'm one of the co-conveners for this year's Hertog Global Strategy Initiative. And tonight we have a very distinguished speaker, Harvey Cox, who's going to talk to us about peace and violence. Harvey is one of the world's, the world's scholar of religion and religion in the public space, but also a public intellectual. He's one of the few academics, and I don't know, Harvey, are you the only academic who's sold more than 1 million, close to 1 million, I know you're humble, of his book called The Secular City. And then he's most recently published a book called, what is it, The Faith? Future of Faith, that's right. And he's published upwards of a dozen books. And this is part of this year's strategy initiative, which is looking at religious violence and apocalyptic movements. In prior years, we've looked at nuclear proliferation and pandemics, which has been funded very generously by Roger Hertog. Matt Connolly is usually here with us co-convening this. He's in Algeria working on research. So tonight I'm going to lead the discussion. Harvey's going to lecture for about 40 minutes, and then we're going to open it up to questions and answer session. And with that, Harvey, I'm going to hand it over to you. I should say a little bit about his background, of course. Other than that, he's still at Harvard University, where he's been since 1965, the holder of the Hollis Chair, which has the distinction of being the oldest named chair in the United States. It was established in 1727, I believe, so in the 18th century. And why the chair is so important is some people make the case that it actually set up the American Academy in the sense of having experts in disciplines. Prior to that, we had tutors and broad-based scholars, and the Hollis Chair actually was set up by a wealthy man back in the 18th century with the idea that we should have experts, eminent experts, elevated in their area. And so Harvey is the proud recipient of that chair and has been holding it for decades. So as I said, he's going to speak for about 40 minutes and then we'll open it up. So join me in welcoming him.
Well, thank you very much, Monica, and hello to all of you. Great to be here and also to see my old friend and colleague, Monica Toft, again. We have an International Affairs Center at Harvard as well, but your view is much better, I have to say. Much better than ours, which just looks out on an alley on one side and other buildings on the other. This is far superior. I'm going to talk a little bit this evening about what has been called texts of terror. Texts of terror. And the discussion emerges to some extent, although not completely, from the discovery after the 9/11 attacks, that the men who crashed those planes into the buildings were found to have had in their possession passages from the Quran. This immediately set up in many people's minds the notion that these texts that they had read, maybe they hadn't read, they at least had them in their possession, had a direct bearing on the violence that they instigated there in that attack. And it caused a lot of people to ask once again and think more systematically about the actual relationship between texts in various scriptural traditions, some of which are very, very violent, some of those texts. What is the actual relationship between, let's say, texts of terror and actual terrorist activities? And the more you think about it, the less straightforward it becomes. Questions emerge. For example, what about all the other 999,000 people in the world, Muslims, who have read and pondered and prayed these passages from the Quran, but didn't hijack planes and fly them into buildings? How do you explain them? How do you explain that these texts were found? Is there any direct bearing between those texts and what these guys did? If so, what is it? Another question that comes to mind This is something we've been thinking about, and I've been thinking about for over the last decade. Why do certain texts lie dormant over many years in a scriptural tradition? They are read, they are studied, they're chanted, they're prayed, and yet they don't seem to spark or incite any kind of violence. Why is that? And then at a certain moment, they are plucked out of their dormancy. They are deployed for certain purposes in a completely new situation, not the one that they first emerged from. Why does that happen? And how is that? How does that related to the link, if any, or what it is between texts and acts of terror? So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. And then I'm also going to talk about how texts, scriptural texts, migrate from one religious tradition to the other, are picked up in certain religious traditions, are infused into it, are reinterpreted within the reference points of another religion. And finally, I'm going to say a little bit about what I call the distillation of texts. So we got 3 different points here. First, the deploying of texts, and secondly, what I would call the migration of texts from one tradition to another, and then the distillation of text. By distillation, I mean people who draw values from the traditions that those texts come from and express, but do not rely on the texts themselves. In fact, might even suggest that they're not relying on them. Now, one of the great conundrums for me is how a particular text, a specific text, can be used in such a radically different way. And here's the example I'm going to give you. It's a text from the Hindu scripture called the Bhagavad Gita. It's part of the larger corpus called the Mahabharata. The Bhagavad Gita, the Song of the Lord. It's a short text of about the 1st century of the Christian era. And it tells the story, as many of you know, of the warrior who is struggling with the whole question of whether he should go through with this terrible battle. He's on the battlefront. He's right there, ready to go the next day. His name is Arjuna. He's a prince, and he says in this text in the Bhagavad Gita, as he looked across and saw all the people on the other side, many of them his kinsmen, and looked up and down the row of his own soldiers, he began to shake. His sword dropped out of his hand. Beads of perspiration appeared on his forehead, and he could hardly continue. And so he prays. He asks his chariot driver to drive him up and down in front of these rows of warriors about to slaughter and wreak mayhem on each other. And as it turns out, the driver of the chariot turns out to be none other than Krishna himself. And Krishna says the following to Arjuna. And the blessed Lord said, "You are speaking, Arjuna, with learned words. You are mourning, however, for what is not worthy of grief. Those who are wise lament, neither for the living nor for the dead." In another translation of this text, it says, "Why are you shedding tears over that for which no tears should be shed?" He goes on to point out that it's indifferent whether one kills or doesn't kill, whether one survives the battle or doesn't survive the battle, because the main thing that Arjuna has to do is to fulfill his karma, fulfill his caste duty. And his caste duty is that he is a warrior, and therefore he must fulfill that responsibility. Now, I mention this text for a surprising, at least when I first discovered it, a very surprising reason, namely that it is the favorite text of none other than Mahatma Gandhi. Mahatma Gandhi loved the Bhagavad Gita. When he was a lad, he learned parts of it in the Sanskrit, although he claimed later he didn't really know what it meant, and kept referring to it his whole life. In fact, ironically, it was when he went to London to study law, and his mother told him that when you get to London now, stay away from three things: whiskey, meat, and women. So Gandhi immediately looked around and found a rooming house, and a vegetarian rooming house, and moved in there, and found that he was with people there whom we might call nowadays kind of New Age types. They were influenced by Rudolf Steiner and some other contemporary New Age thinkers, and they used to read various things to each other in the evenings after they had their vegetarian dinners. And one of the things that they read was the Bhagavad Gita in English, an English translation. And Gandhi says suddenly, for the first time, he got the meaning of the Bhagavad Gita. He'd memorized parts of it in Sanskrit, but he didn't really know what it meant. He read it, and it became his life text. Now, why would a text urging you not to weep over slaughter and suffering and mayhem be the favorite text of the principal exemplar of nonviolence in the 20th century? How could that happen? Well, it happened because Gandhi insisted throughout his life that this should not be a text that you interpret literally. You do an injustice to a text. It's poetry. It's divine poetry, and what it refers to, Gandhi said, is the internal struggle that all of us face between the good and the evil within us, and we have to engage in that struggle, but it's an internal struggle. It's not against external enemies at all. And he claims also that when he read the Bhagavad Gita, a few weeks later, at the same vegetarian rooming house, they read the Sermon on the Mount, which he had never heard before, Sermon on the Mount, in which Jesus says, "Love those who hate you, pray for those who despitefully use you. You have heard it said that you shall love your neighbors, but hate your enemies. But I say unto you, love your enemies." Now, Gandhi says in his autobiography that this, as he puts it, this text went directly to his heart. And it reminded him and evoked passages from the Bhagavad Gita, which he integrated in his own mind. Now, I go at this at some length, because, oddly enough, a man named Nathuram Vinayak Godse, whom you have probably not heard of or only heard of incidentally, was an Indian who was also a student of the Bhagavad Gita, was Godse, and formed by it, but read it in a very different way. Read it as legitimating violence to save his people, the Hindu people, from what he took to be the threat of Muslims and anyone else who would threaten them. Now, Godse is infamous, I suppose is the word, because on January 28th, 1948, he assassinated Gandhi. He assassinated Gandhi in New Delhi. So here you had this curious confrontation between two men, both of whom were devoted students of the Bhagavad Gita. One of them read it in this nonviolent way, the other read it in a violent way, and killed one of them, killed the other. Godse went on to say, by the way, that he firmly believed that by killing Gandhi, who he thought was compromising the relationship with Muslims in India, he was killing in order to heal. Killing in order to heal. Now, here is something that a seminar like this really ought to be thinking about. How often the metaphor of healing is used to justify killing. I'm not going to talk about that this evening, but it seems an important motif. Robert J. Lifton, in his book on the Nazi doctors, for example, when he interviewed the Nazi doctors who had consigned people to the flames and the gas chambers, he said, "How could you do this? You took an oath as a physician to heal people. How could you engage in this kind of violent activity?" And one doctor after another would say to him, "Because we were healing our people from an infection, from a cancerous growth, from these lesser races. They had to be eradicated for the health of our people." The metaphor of healing, violence for healing, has played, alas, a rather large role in the relationship between of violence and terrorism and all the rest. My point here, however, my first point, is to ask the question, a simple question: how are certain texts, like this one, like a Bhagavad Gita, interpreted in such radical ways by different people at different times? It certainly does blur the picture of a direct line between a text and an act of terrorism. It blurs it almost beyond recognition. I'm not going to try to answer that question this evening, except to say that texts, when they are retrieved and deployed in new situations, direct us to pay attention to the situation in which they are being resurrected and deployed. What is going on there? This is what we call in theology, I guess, the enterprise of hermeneutics. And I want to underline my next sentence here. The texts of any kind, texts are not self-interpreting. Texts are not self-interpreting. The meaning of a text is not in the text itself. The meaning arises between the reader, the interpreter, the community within which that reader is interpreting the text, the history of that text's interpretation, the historical situation of that community, and that all of these go into the vastly complicated task called hermeneutics. But more and more, as we study the use and deployment of texts, it becomes clear that simply reading the text is not going to produce much. Reading the history of the interpretations of texts in different situations, different eras, by different people, may in fact cast some light on it. Now that's point one, and we can return to that with some of your questions and queries if you'd like. What I call this is the deploying of texts, the problem of the deploying of texts. Now I want to say something about what I call the migration of texts. Now, texts which emerge originally in a particular context, a particular religion, can be picked up and transferred and used in another tradition. And here I would go back to the Sermon on the Mount, found in the 5th chapter of the Gospel of Matthew. Sermon on the Mount: love those who hate you, pray for those who despitefully use you, and the extremely radical statement of Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount, which is, you have heard it said of old, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy, but I say unto you, love your enemies. Now that's a very original statement. One doesn't find statements like that in almost any other religious tradition, that explicitly at least. Love your enemies. Now this was the passage in the New Testament which also became Gandhi's life text, love your enemies. And he elaborated on it in a most remarkable way. It wasn't just that you do not use violence against your opponent. That's the least of it. You are willing to sacrifice and to suffer pain yourself in order not to defeat your opponent, but to win over. Don't win, but win over. He strongly believed in the power of persuasion and in the power of sacrificial example to win people over. He also took it another step. You can see this if you read the history of his campaign in India against the British Raj. When he sensed that the government against whom he was directing demonstrations and hunger strikes and sit-ins and the rest was at a disadvantage, they had something else going on, he would call off a demonstration or a march and announce to them that he wasn't going through with it because he didn't think it was right to take advantage of your opponent when your opponent is in a tough situation. Wait until they are recovered and then take them on non-violently. Now, I suppose the turning point, one could argue, in Gandhi's career was his famous Salt March across India, from village to village, from town to town, toward the beach, where he and his followers would simply wade into the waters, the salt water there, reach down and pick out some of the salt, put it in a package, and take it home. This was illegal. The British government had a monopoly on salt production. Gandhi not only led this march across India, and a perfectly ingenious idea, by the way, which later gave rise to ideas like the march from Selma to Montgomery. King was directly influenced by reading about the Salt March. They walked from village to village, village to village. Everybody knew what was going on, including the government knew what was going on. They got to the, and just as they arrived at the beach, the British Raj arrested Gandhi and put him in prison, one of his many terms in prison. And he, which was a tactical error of colossal significance for the British to do that, because this catalyzed his followers, because he had been whisked off to prison. So if you've ever read the account of that march, one of the most moving stories I think I've ever read in my life, of rows and rows of young Indian men walking toward the beach with the police with their metal-sheathed clubs waiting for them as they walked toward the beach, knocking them down, bashing their heads and arms. Another wave would come, they would be knocked down, and another wave would come, so until the beach was piled with groans and shrieks of these young men who were marching one after another, file by file, non-violently, toward the sea. As someone once said, of course, a lot of people were hurt. They didn't even reach the sea. But on that day, the British Empire in India ended. That was the day when the moral high ground, which the British had claimed, was evacuated forever through a completely nonviolent march, the Salt March. Now, when you read the history of Gandhi's India, what he was doing in India, the question is often raised, and it's worth bringing up because somebody here may think of it. What role did the Indian National Army play during this period? The Indian National Army was was recruited by Indian nationalists to fight the British during the period of the Raj and even into the Second World War, and they were not nonviolent. They were committed to what we might later call, or call then, armed struggle, the National Army. Now, Gandhi has sometimes alluded to the fact that he found, although he disapproved of the use of violence against the British Raj, he found that they were in fact useful because it made his movement look so good. You've got to choose between the Gandhian movement and the Indian National Army. Maybe it's better to go with Gandhi. That may or may not have been the case, but still, I was reminded when I read that part in Gandhi of the relationship, the rather complex relationship between Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X. You may recall back in the 1960s, Malcolm X was very critical of King. Malcolm X kept saying we must use any means necessary, including violence, to win our freedom from racism and segregation here in America. And King kept saying, if I'm the last person in America to continue to preach nonviolence, I will continue to preach it. I knew Dr. King. I worked with him and even went to jail on one occasion, in the same jail. It's one of my claims to fame, to have been in the same jail with Martin Luther King briefly. No jail is pleasant, by the way. I would not advise it. And nonetheless, that's an experience that I treasure. People have asked me, what was it about King that you admired most? And my first answer is his sheer physical courage, his willingness to walk out into the teeth of a mob with clubs and sometimes with worse weapons than that, of course with insults and all the rest, to walk out there without revealing the fact that he had told us that he was, of course, frightened. He was an epitome of physical courage. But the other thing about him, and probably the thing that will even last longer, is his unswerving commitment to nonviolence. He was utterly committed to it. He was influenced by Gandhi, although only theoretically at first. He'd read Gandhi when he was in seminary and in college. He didn't know much about how you organize nonviolent movements. It was James Lawson, a young black Methodist pastor who had worked with the Gandhian movement in India, who King brought to his staff and asked him to be the actual organizer of people into nonviolent groups and train them in nonviolence, which Jim Lawson did, and multiplied those workshops all around the South and in other places as well. And I remember, just to introduce one brief anecdotal recollection, of sitting in a black church, I think it was in Birmingham, with young people, mainly very, very young people, planning and praying and singing and getting ready to go out and march. It had been a very tough day the day before in Birmingham. Dogs and police dogs and hoses, all the rest. And we were sitting there, and we were singing, and we were praying. And Dr. King said, now we're going to stop for a moment, and I want everyone here to search your heart to see if there's in your heart even a tiny trace of hatred against the people out there who are screaming at you, maybe ready to physically assault you. If there's one trace of hatred there, don't march. Don't march. Won't be disgrace, but we're going to sit here and we're going to sing some more until you have been able to look inside candidly and frankly and see if there's any trace of hatred. Now, King later said that he derived this idea, this discipline, from his reading of the New Testament, especially the example of Jesus, that hatred and bigotry begin in the heart and then are expressed outwardly. So unless you can get at the root of it, it's still going to influence you. Texts do migrate. And here's a text which has migrated back and forth. Tolstoy read the Sermon on the Mount. Gandhi read Tolstoy and read some of the other advocates of nonviolence, and then King read Gandhi, and so we have a global exchange of a text which sort of takes on a life of its own. Begins to live within another culture. Gandhi never became a Christian, although he affirmed that the nonviolence of the New Testament was one of the keystones of his life. Now, I want to end with a couple remarks. I won't take as long with this, about something rather intriguing to me, especially in recent years, is how this tradition of nonviolent protest has spread and been applied in various places around the world. Let me just mention a few of them for you. There was Gandhi, and then there was Martin Luther King and the American Civil Rights Movement, which we called then the Freedom Movement. A few years ago, I was in Poland and had the great honor to meet Lech Walesa, who still lives there in Warsaw, still looks the way he did. He has handlebar mustache, scrappy, rotund guy. And I was with a group of students and asked him if he would come and speak to them about his experience in leading the Solidarity movement. He said he would be happy to do that, and he did so. Spoke in Polish, was translated into English. And he came in to speak to this group wearing on his lapel a little medallion of Our Lady of Czestochowa. Lech Walesa was a very, very devout Roman Catholic who said in his little talk to us that without, he said, without God and without Our Lady of Czestochowa, we would never have succeeded against the Russian occupation and the communist government of Poland. Never. He said, in fact, if you had fed all of the data into a computer, they have 11 divisions here. They have the entire mass media. They have the only legitimate political parties. Can you have a successful revolution? The computer would have said, no, not possible. Doesn't compute. And what Walesa said was, but the computer wasn't taking into consideration Our Lady of Czestochowa, who was the virgin apparition viewed as the kind of queen figure of Poland. So they did succeed, and they succeeded in a way that allowed for the rollback of communism in Eastern Europe. It was the beginning of the end of Soviet communism, happening ironically in something called the Lenin shipyard in Warsaw. History has a curious, ironic sense of humor. Here you are in the Lenin shipyard with a leader who has a devotion to the Virgin Mary, leading a nonviolent protest movement, Solidarity, which in fact succeeds. But that wasn't the end. When the Berlin Wall fell in 11/9 of 89, not 9/11, but 11/9, young people were standing around the wall on both sides singing, "We shall overcome," in German. The migration of this idea, or this text from here to there, where it took hold. We shall overcome. Then, and just a year and a half ago, we watched as thousands of young people in Tahrir Square in Cairo marched and demonstrated nonviolently. Hundreds of thousands kept a nonviolent discipline despite enormous provocations throughout all that series of demonstrations. And one of the reasons, you'll really enjoy this, I think, is that circulated around Cairo about a year and a half before this in thousands of copies, was a comic book called The Montgomery Story about Martin Luther King and nonviolence. I have a copy at home. I was going to bring it and I forgot. The wonderful thing about this comic book is it's printed on a kind of tough paper that's resilient paper. When I asked about why that is, someone said, well, because Egyptians like to read their books and their comic books in coffee houses. This is so you can spill your coffee on this and still legible. It was distributed in thousands, tens of thousands of copies, and studied, perused, and so by the time of the Tahrir Square demonstrations, the idea of nonviolence had migrated there. Now, of course, we don't know how that's all going to turn out yet, and it's been, some aspects of it have been very disappointing, but it's hard not to be impressed with how those young people not only maintained a nonviolent discipline, but also erected a perimeter and prevented people from coming in who weren't going to maintain that discipline. That is a remarkable achievement. So now, I only have one moment to talk about the distillation of text, so I'll just put it this way. One of the great recent breakthroughs, recent is in the last 10 years, in nonviolence, has been the work of Gene Sharp, the theoretician, historian of nonviolence, who lives in Boston, and who insists that you don't have to be a spiritual or religious person at all to practice nonviolence. In fact, Sharp sometimes says that can sometimes be diverting. All you have to do is to know your enemy, know how the power is wielded, know where the chinks are in the armor, and be willing to go piecemeal. Don't try everything all at once. Try piecemeal movements, piecemeal demands, and his theory here being that power, governmental power, other kinds of power, is dependent on the compliance of those over whom it is wielded. And if you qualify that compliance, if you step back from it, if you don't comply, if you resist it nonviolently or simply don't obey it, then eventually the power loses its power. You don't fight with your opponent's best weapon, says Gene Sharp. Quote, you become a brave but dead soldier. He's very suspicious of people who lie down in front of tanks, people who are willing to be martyrs. Martyrs don't usually help, he insists. And I think he's been proven. There was also, by the way, under Gene Sharp's auspices, that workshops were organized around Cairo, dozens and dozens of workshops, learning nonviolent techniques, using the Montgomery story in its comic book form, and preparing for the Tahrir Square demonstration. So here we are at the end. I've talked now a little bit about the deployment of text, the strange fact that the same text can be deployed in such radically different ways depending on the circumstances and the deployer. Talked about the migration of text, ideas from one tradition to another, and also about what I would call the distillation, that is taking the values and insights of religiously inspired, nonviolent texts and applying them in a kind of a nonviolent methodology. So thank you very much, Monica, for having me here, and I think I'm ready to move on to the next phase here.
All right, well, thank you. So Harvey, I just want to push you a little bit on the hermeneutical idea. As you know, we're running a seminar this summer on religion and apocalyptic movements, and we've gone back and forth as a group trying to figure out a definition of religion. What is religion? And if we take your discussion about the hermeneutics, that religious text, which is the basis of many religions, you talked about Hinduism, the Bhagavad Gita, you talked about terror, texts of terror. One could make the argument the Old Testament is that, texts of peace, the New Testament, people make that argument. But if it's the case that you have this sort of deployment, migration, and distillation, can we ever really talk about a religion in Islam or some sort of continuity through time if it's constantly changing and being reinterpreted? How do we as scholars, how do we as policymakers think about religion in those terms if it's the case that it's constantly open to redeployment, reinterpretation, and distillation, not only within a given tradition, but across traditions? And I think you did a brilliant job talking about sort of the nonviolent movement as sort of migrating across borders and across faith traditions. But can we talk about religions, particular kinds, or is it religion?
It's not easy.
In 5 minutes. No.
No, it's not easy. In fact, after spending most of my career, or all my career, studying something called religion, and how religions change and how they mix and how they, I have asked myself that question many times. What degree of continuity is there, let's say in Islam, from the days of the Prophet until now? What continuity is there between Christianity from the days of Jesus and the Apostles, or any of these? Well, there is both continuity and discontinuity, which makes it a very complex but very interesting task. What is left behind and what isn't left behind when a religion develops further? Under what circumstances are certain elements left behind? For example, we know pretty well that when a religious tradition moves from one culture to another, what appears in that new culture is not the same, identical, as what it's set out to be. Things drop by the wayside, other things are picked up, sometimes things from the indigenous culture, they're melded into it. But there's enough continuity that you would probably recognize, yeah, that's still Islam, or that's still Christianity, that's still Judaism. Now, the fundamentalists in our midst would tell us, there are certain elements that if you don't have them in this new modified or enculturated system, it's not really Christianity, it's not really Judaism, it's not really Islam. But they are swimming against the stream because the history of any of these religions is their uncanny ability to survive by adapting without sacrificing an element of the core message that they have. That's the balance they have to continue to maintain. And it's not an easy one, but it makes it a very interesting thing to study. The granddad's religion, and even in the same tradition, great-granddad, forebears, bears a certain recognizable continuity, but is very different in many important respects from what we practice now.
Yeah, because one of the interesting things is, with the exception of different interpretations or translations of text, is that we assume or we take for granted that texts are constant, right? But now you've totally problematized that by saying no, because there's historical context. Words take on different meanings depending upon the context of the time, the history of the time.
Well, that's also the fundamentalist point. That a text
there's
says what it means what it says. They're very suspicious of interpretation. You don't interpret, you just read it, and there it is. And whether it's the Quran or the New Testament or Old Testament or whatever it is, the fundamentalist view is deep suspicion of interpretation.
Well, the text is inerrant, right? That's one of their fundamental principles.
Yeah, inerrant. Although it hasn't saved them from enormous differences of opinion in what an inerrant text means. They can, they can really go to the mat and fight each other, each claiming it's inerrant, but finding different meanings for it.
Yeah, so I want to, shift it a little bit because, you're talking about texts, but then when you gave us all of your examples, Martin Luther King, Gandhi, much of your examples, as you drew on that, was about what these men actually did, right? So it was actually the process of doing. In Christianity, we talk about bearing witness. And for you, what was so profound about Martin Luther King was his physical courage, actually going out. And so it seemed to have been not only the combination of a given interpretation or a self-interpretation of a text and what it meant. You talked about Gandhi and his heart, but also the fact that these men were willing, and your examples were all men, what they were doing as a result of that, and then others seeing that and either being cowed or becoming fearful, the soldier who doesn't want to be martyred, and or followers saying, if he is willing to do that, I'm willing to follow suit.
Yeah, right.
And
No, I think that's a very good point, that often the most persuasive interpretations of texts are not simply ideational or not simply worded translations, but translations in action. What does this mean in a particular, for action in a particular context?
That's right, and it has much more power. And again, they have to interpret not only the text, but the activities within that text. And as you say, today there has been sort of an increase in the number of nonviolent movements. Yes, violence is still around, but nonviolence is seen as an effective means of challenging states.
And that's something relatively new, I think, in human history, when you think about it. You could almost write a counter history of the 19th and 20th centuries. This dreadful 20th century which came out of, just replete with violence and hatred and wars, and look back and see another thread there, which is the gradual growth of the viability of nonviolent movements. From Gandhi to King to the Berlin Wall to Tahrir Square, the monks in Myanmar. Now, some people say, well, yeah, but these movements failed sometimes. Tiananmen Square, that was a nonviolent movement, and they rolled the tanks over those kids, right? It failed. Well, did it fail or not? We don't quite know yet. And as far as Myanmar is concerned, those Buddhist monks were out there demonstrating and also being beaten up and taken to prison and tortured, and nothing seemed to happen for a while. But then it did begin to happen. And now you have, I always can't give all of her names, Dawn Young Singh, who says, when she makes her talks now, now's the moment that we've been waiting for all this time, and we have to seize this moment and make sure that we don't lose it, because it might take a long time for it to happen again. So nonviolent movements are not necessarily instantly successful at all, but they may have a success in the long run, or they may not.
All right, so one last question, then I invite people to the microphone over to my right, which is there something unique or particular about religion that empowers people to sort of go in the face and have this courage? I'm a student of nationalism as well.
Yeah.
I studied the Soviet Union for a very long time, and there was a lot of self-sacrifice for communist ideology and socialism, very teleological ideas that some great period in history is going to be achieved. But as a scholar and somebody who's thought about religion and religious ideals and beliefs, does religion provide an extra push for people to sacrifice? You used the term martyr a couple of times in your talk tonight. Or is it similar to other sort of deep-seated beliefs that people may have as they challenge existing authorities?
Similar but not identical, I would say. There is something about the full package of a religious tradition, which includes the poetry, the theology, the history, the liturgy, the values, the stories. They all go into this mix, which together provide a very an elixir, an energetic source of energy, which and a movement, let's say like early communism had a lot of that in it, but not all of it, not all of it. And the labor movement in this country had that, but religions have that extra dimension, I think, which, alas, however, motivates people in different directions. I think, don't you think this example of Gandhi and Godse is the most amazing thing? I ran across that just in some reading I was doing some months ago. These two guys looking at this same text, Arjuna and Krishna in the Bhagavad Gita, and coming and deriving such different things. I don't know much about Godse. I want to read some more about him and where he was coming from, what it was that fed into his hermeneutical starting point, you might say, which was different from Gandhi's. But I think you have to say, you and I have both studied religion for quite a while, a little bit longer than you have, and you know that it's not only can motivate people to peace and compassion, brotherhood, but to hatred and xenophobia. It's a very powerful elixir that can go either way, I'm afraid.
No, and also it's sometimes, in a couple of your examples, it's directed outward, right? So the killing is healing, which is very powerful, but then also directed inward is purification, right? So you can do harm to others at the same time. This is what with 9/11, if you had read Muhammad Atta's letter, some people have interpreted that as, yes, he's sort of killing is healing, but also purification of himself, having sullied himself in the West, and that as a good Muslim, this was a bad thing. And so there was this multiple motivation that was going on as he was doing, at least his letter sort of expresses that. So I open it up to the audience. If anybody has any questions, you can go to the mic. Yes, so there's a microphone over here. We're recording this, and please introduce yourselves.
Hello, my name is Kathleen Kenny, and I'm a retired math teacher, and I'm a member of the community. At any rate, Professor Cox, you talked about different terms like love your enemies. What I feel I have to understand clearly is, what do you mean by love? What is love? What is an enemy? Okay? What do we mean by violence? And exactly what is nonviolence? Nonviolence can take a physical form, or it could take the form of a book, or it could take the form of indoctrination of children. So I think that those things have to be examined. And also, like you were talking, that people interpret texts differently. And I fully accept that. But having said that, an enemy of yours might be you might hate someone that I love, and vice versa. And who's to say who's right?
Do you want to take that on?
I might feel fully validated in that is wrong, I don't believe it, that's the way I interpret it. You do the opposite. So where does that put us? Does that make you and me enemies?
Well, I think I'm following you here. I hope not. I hope it doesn't make us enemies. I think to go back to the beginning of your question, I think when it's hard to know exactly what Jesus had in mind when he said, "Love your enemies." I can't peer into his soul or his psyche about that, but he was part of the Jewish tradition. He was a rabbi, and their understanding is of love as a kind of an encompassing compassion, a commitment to the well-being of the other. Commitment to the well-being of the other. Dr. King used to say, when I say love somebody, I don't mean you have to like them. You don't have to like them. but loving them means being seriously committed to that person's health and well-being as a fellow creature of God with the same rights and that you have, and recognizing that and being committed to it. So an enemy, I guess, can be a person who you perceive as wanting to be destructive of your or your people's health and well-being. And how do you deal with them? I'm just guessing now. And now, of course, for many, many years after the Sermon on the Mount was first delivered, it was interpreted by many people as applying only to interpersonal affairs. Your neighbor, your immediate opponent on your block or something like that, and not to apply to groups of people, nations or groups of people. That was really not something that was thought about very much over the history of, in this case, Christian ethics. You always realized that war had to be justified as something that you'd go into as a last resort, or war or violence as a last resort, and you try other things first, but you don't eliminate the possibility of using violence if it seems required. It was Gandhi, more than anyone else, who amplified and enlarged this notion of loving your enemy, turning the other cheek and so on, to empower a whole social movement. That had never happened, to my knowledge, before Gandhi. So it was a translation, if you will, of a very powerful text, which had a kind of an interpersonal application to much larger, to a larger scale, and then went on from there to the civil rights movement and Tahrir Square and all the rest. But it started with that insight by Gandhi that this is something that shouldn't be limited simply to interpersonal affairs.
Okay, I just have to say, just in closing, just 30 seconds. If I were with the group with Martin Luther King and he said, okay, stop. If there's a trace of hate in your heart, don't go. I don't think to this day, I think I would still be sitting there, you know, and I think of the political scene in our country today, how much, you know, I find it very difficult not to dislike certain members of Congress. Yeah, okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. So, Jason?
Hi, Jason Olson. I'm a PhD student at Brandeis University. And I just wanted to find out more about your thoughts about your book, The Future of Faith. I really liked the chapter on liberation theology, and it brought up a number of questions for me. Because you've tracked it for a while now, and you wrote another book about it too. Personally, I'm a Mormon progressive, and I have a lot of friends in Latin America that suffer more than most people in the United States even care to know. And you brought up interesting questions about the role of hierarchy and the struggles that Catholic liberation theologians have had in overcoming the hierarchy. I'm thinking of how to approach this in the sense of dealing with Western metropoles, in the sense the Catholic movement in Latin America had to deal with Rome, as you illustrated in your chapter. And I'm thinking there's a similar situation in the United States with Mormonism, with Salt Lake City. It's a similar metropole. In an affluent Western country.
Would you explain why it's similar? That's an interesting idea.
The hierarchical structure. I mean, my friends in Latin America, Mormon friends in Latin America, I think are dealing with a similar situation that Catholic movements have had, and how they've had to, the indigenous leaders have had to relate to Rome. And there's also indigenous hierarchical leaders in the Mormon Church also in Latin America, and I think that they're struggling to learn from the successful movements in Latin America that Catholics have had. I think like the decentralized Protestant movements in Latin America don't have to worry about that as much. They're already indigenous, and they don't have a Western metropole to answer to or be accountable to. So I'm wondering your thoughts. You brought up questions about the future, and it got me thinking, because there's definitely a question about indigenous rights and indigenous justice, even in Mormon theology, in the Book of Mormon, etc. And I'm wondering what lessons you've learned from studying your time in Mexico and looking through Catholic Latin America that maybe could help other Christians or movements in Latin America to have a healthy liberation theology.
Yeah. Let me take a step back and say that the liberation theology movement in Latin America emerged, as you probably know, after the Second Vatican Council, when the bishops of Latin America met to ask themselves, this was in the late 60s, 68, how does this breakthrough, this renewal in the Catholic Church around the world apply in our continent, where there is so much grinding poverty and hunger and despair? How does it apply here? Not how it applies in Europe or somewhere, but how does it apply here? And they talked about that, and they came up with what became then the kind of slogan that the church should have a preferential option for the poor. That is, the church, instead of being a kind of a marriage counselor, sitting between impoverished peasants and wealthy landowners and trying to help them sort it out, should place itself on the side of the disinherited and the marginalized and the poor, its resources, its teaching, and all the rest. Not to be neutral. Don't try to be neutral anymore. This is not a situation for neutrality. And it made an enormous impact in the deployment of personnel, schools, hospitals, money, all the rest in Latin America to organize what turned out to be the base community movement, which was an alternative to the hierarchy, that became the vehicle for liberation theology and for liberation movements inspired by liberation theologies. Now, I think the built-in flaw, which later turned out to be almost fatal, not entirely fatal, for that movement, was that it never shed its hierarchical profile. That is, it was the bishops who, if not inventing it, at least made it possible. And when Rome became very uncomfortable with the liberation theology movement, especially the present Pope, when he was the head of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, and issued decrees condemning liberation theology, the way they dealt with it was to, one by one, make sure that the bishops who were supporting it and facilitating it were replaced by people who wouldn't do that, who were simply Roman loyalists. And although the seeds are still there, there's still plenty of thinking. Just a few years ago, I was in Brazil at a conference in which it was kind of passing on the torch conference. They brought in some old guys like me and some of the original liberation theologians, Latin American Catholics, and they had several hundred young people, Protestants, Catholics, Pentecostals, who were trying to pick up on this vision of a religious tradition that was unashamedly on the side of those in need and the brokenhearted and the weary, to use biblical language here, and supporting them rather than adjudicating between them and their opponents. So I don't think it's gone. I think it has been to some extent de-hierarchicalized, And the people who are involved in it now are, by and large, lay people who are in education and in government and medicine, press, and other activities, but still maintaining that spirit.
Great, thank you.
You use Gandhi as an example, and one of Gandhi's tools were political fasts. And I was wondering, which are still very popular in India. And when
Political what?
political fasts.
Fasting, oh yes. Mhm.
And when the Indian Union government characterizes political fasts, they use similar language to describe terrorist attacks. And I was wondering if you would fit fasting under, and self-harm in general, under violent or nonviolent political protest.
Hey, that's a really, really good question, isn't it? Doing violence to yourself. The question often comes up with those people who burn themselves, like the street merchant there in Tunisia, to whom is attributed the whole beginning of the Tahrir movement and the Arab Spring, who immolated himself as just a cry of protest against the way he was being treated, or the Buddhist monks during the Vietnam War, who engaged in self-immolation. I think it's a very, very hard one, and I would myself prefer to avoid martyrdom. I'm on Gene Sharp's side here. I think you can do it without martyrdom. That's what I'd like. Now, Gandhi knew very well when he was fasting that if he died during a fast against the British Raj, all kinds of violence would break out in India. There would be outrage, there would be pillaging, there'd be marches, there'd be killings. He knew that. He knew that. And some people think that even though he said at times, I'm going to fast unto death for this particular political objective, that he probably would not have done that, because he knew that there was a veiled threat of violence in his fasting. The Irish, the IRA people who fasted unto death in Irish prisons is another example of people who did really go the whole way. You know, I want to, I'd like to interject here. It's a very serious discussion. One, at least semi-humorous, wonderful memory I have of Dr. King, if I might. And that was when he became very convinced that he had to be equally critical of the Vietnam War as he was of racism and segregation in America. He made this famous speech at Riverside Church down the street here, where he came out against the Vietnam War. And I was at the next meeting of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. There were 40, 50 people in the room, and Dr. King came in and said, I am thinking about fasting, and fasting to stop the bombing of North Vietnam. And I am thinking about fasting, as Gandhi did, until it stops, and if it doesn't stop, to continue to fast unto death. I'm going to fast. And at least that's the idea I have. And I want to ask all of you, there were about 50 of us in the room, you can check this out in his biography. He surfaced that idea, and and he was sitting out, I remember very distinctly, he was sitting in front, no table in front of him, just sitting like this, talking about this idea. And he said, now what do you think of it? Should I do this? And there was an embarrassed silence in the room. And after a few minutes, A.D. King, who was Martin Luther King's brother, the chubbier brother, said to him, Martin, I know you, and I know how much you like food. Martin, I don't think this is a good idea. And I remember watching King. He sat there, and then after a while he started laughing. laughing about it. And I'm not sure whether he was trying out an idea and hoping to get a response like this, no, don't do it, whether he was really serious. He was probably quite serious about it. But he never did use fasting, to my knowledge. Well, very brief fasts he did sometimes, in the way that Gandhi did. In fact, when I was in that jail that I referred to, we decided that we were going to fast to get permission to integrate the jail. This was a segregated jail in the South. Have the black and white prisoners brought into the same cell block. Somebody else made that decision. I didn't make it. They said we're going to fast. So we started fasting one day, and they would bring in our lunch and our dinner. It was pretty simple fare, and we'd send it back. And after a day or two, a couple of us raised the very question, look, is this really nonviolent, what we're doing? Aren't we doing a certain kind of violence to ourselves, which we shouldn't be doing? And by that time, I was getting hungry enough to say, yeah, we are doing something we shouldn't be doing to ourselves. And, but just saved by the bell, I remember the warden came in and said, how come you guys aren't eating here? And he said, you know why we're not eating. This is what we... And he said, okay. We're going to integrate this jail. He said, but we're not going to integrate anything else in this town, I'll tell you that. So they did. They took some white prisoners and put them over to the black cell block and brought some black prisoners over. So we had our, so to speak, our cake and ate it too. We were threatening to fast and didn't fast and really achieved that somewhat limited objective. Fasting, it's very, very dangerous. I think very dangerous weapon, and I would personally advise against it, and I think Gene Sharp would too, the theoretician, that this is really approaching a kind of martyrdom which can be misleading and can escalate things in a way that is not constructive.
Thanks.
Hi, I'm Bob. I'm an undergrad here at the college at Columbia. And you spoke quite a bit about, obviously, the role that religious texts and these kinds of interpretations can play to inspire people, to influence them, change their entire lives. But on the flip side, and you've alluded to this, is the ability of people with preconceived notions to use texts for their own ends and use them as a justification without perhaps believing them, but oftentimes without necessarily truly believing in what they're saying about these texts and these ideas, but just using them for their own ends. I was just wondering how we might go about historiographically looking at the influence of this kind of pattern, throughout the ages. What approach we might have to this kind of historical problem.
Yeah, that's a question that I was going to raise, and I didn't raise it under the whole question of the first section about the deployment of texts. To what extent do texts actually inspire acts of violence? To what extent do they figure into a larger complex of motivations, even on the part of the person? A part of a motivational pattern, you might say, for violence. To what extent and when are they more or less cynically deployed, let's say by leaders or interpreters, to get something to happen without any kind of profound respect for or even faith in what this text is saying? How do we judge things like mixed motivation? Because most of the things we do, most of the time, we do out of mixed motivation, not reading a text and saying, aha, I think I'll go out and do an act of terror. Or what else we're doing. We understand our own motives to be thoroughly mixed. I think, at least most people do. So it's hard, however, to interpret. It's hard to know how you discover that in the deployment of texts, especially historically. How do you know what was really going on in a particular historical situation with this particular interpreter? How do you know that? The usefulness of that enterprise, even if you don't discover it clearly, is that it raises serious questions about the direct and simple relationship between a text and an act. And I'm afraid there are just a lot of people, especially a lot of people after 9/11, who said, look, those guys has texts from the Quran. Obviously, those texts were what motivated them to do these awful things. Well, we don't know that. We don't really, how much impact those texts had. Maybe, who knows whether they read them or didn't. It's pretty hard. And then, of course, people took the next step. The Quran itself is a book of violence, replete with all these violent texts. And whenever everybody raises that with me, I said, have you read the Old Testament recently?
It's pretty brutal.
It's got about 100 or to 200 texts of terror for every one you'll find in the Quran. And yet, there are millions and millions and millions of people who read this, studied it, prayed over it over all these years, and not been motivated into actions of terror or violence at all. Very, very complicated question. And I'm just pleading that for less than formulaic understanding of the relationship between text and act.
Thank you.
So this will be the last question.
Last question.
Thank you. Kirk Schneider, adjunct faculty at Teachers College in psychology.
What do you teach? Sociology?
Psychology, clinical psychology. Very interested in existential psychology in particular. And on that point, and actually related to your last comment, I wonder what you think of the problem of insignificance as a motivation for religious violence. And in particular, some of the research that's come out of the terror management theory group. It's a group of psychologists who have written a lot about basically the fear of not mattering as an individual, as a subcultural group, as a prime motivation for fanaticism, violence. And Eric Hoffer also, who very much underlined this point.
Yeah. What was the name of our colleague? Jessica
Stern.
Stern.
Yeah, she talked about humiliation.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Jessica Stern, who is our colleague at Harvard, has done quite remarkable research, talking with, well, to condemned, terrorists who are in prison, interviewing them and asking them about things. One of the things she found out was actually texts play very little role in their motivation, very little. What seemed to be the most important motivation for most of these people, they were almost all men, I think all of them were men, was a feeling of being neglected, overlooked, humiliated, deprived of their dignity, not appreciated, not appreciated. Now that's a psychological, that's your bailiwick there.
Yeah.
And it at least the way these guys talked about it, this seemed to be more than any other motivation, the motivation that prompted them into some fairly horrendous things.
Who was the interviewer again?
Jessica Stern.
Jessica Stern,
Yeah.
yeah. What's
So
the
she
title
was
of her?
here 2 weeks ago, and it's Terror in the Mind of God.
Yeah.
Right. And then you may want to read Mark Juergensmeyer's work as well. His is Terror in the Name of God, and he's found similar dynamics about sort of humiliation and sort of the individuals not getting proper respect and accord.
Well, that may go a long way in explaining some of the hermeneutic aspects, the
Mhm.
contextual aspects.
Yeah, no, that's
Yeah,
right.
right,
So-
right. It could, yeah.
Okay, thank you. Well, before we say thank you to Harvey, I just want to let you know that next week we're not meeting. The next meeting is going to be on July 12th, and Nina Shea, Senior Fellow at the Hudson Institute, will be coming. She's a co-author with Paul Marshall of a book called Silenced on Blasphemy. And then we have 3 more speakers after that. We have Armar Bartov coming on July 19th. He's a historian. Ed Hussein, Senior Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, and then Peter Bergen, who's a journalist. We meet
Who's the last one?
Peter Bergen.
Mhm.
He's an expert on sort of terrorism
Yeah.
and nasty things. We meet every Thursday at 6 o'clock from 7:30, and you're welcome to come. Thank you very much, and join me in thanking Harvey for a really wonderful talk.